It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast, episode 97. Hello and welcome to this episode of It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. My name is Ken Zimmerman Jr., and this is the podcast dedicated to the history of professional wrestling between 1860s and 1930. And in this episode, we'll discuss a possible circuit of working collar and elbow wrestlers in the 1860s and 1870s. But first, I wanted to thank everyone who reached out and complimented the episode that I did on Hulk Hogan, which admittedly was not an easy episode to do because I've never been a big fan of the Hulkster, but I wanted to give him the credit he deserved as the biggest star of the 1980s and one of the biggest stars of professional wrestling history, period. I didn't listen to anybody's discussion on Hogan before I recorded that one, and then I went and I listened to a few others. Overall, I think most people tried to be fair. A couple people were a little on the glowing side. And one of those I just wanted to take issue with, and that's because they said Hulk Hogan was a great wrestler. Well, Hulk Hogan was not a great wrestler. He was a huge superstar. He was the biggest star in professional wrestling. But Hogan was never that great in the ring. He did the things that Hulk Hogan should do, and he should be lauded for that. I think some of these big guys today, like Drew McIntyre and Roman Reigns, take too big of risks doing these dives over the top rope and that onto people standing on the outside waiting to catch them. Because I've seen both of them almost overshoot the people that were supposed to be catching them. You overshoot the people that are supposed to be catching you when you're that big, and the consequences can be dire. And if I was these wrestling companies, I would not be letting my biggest stars take these unnecessary risks. But I think that when people die, people have a tendency to look on them fondly and be a little more generous. And Hogan definitely deserves the credit for being the biggest superstar of the 1980s and the person that made the national expansion possible for what Vince McMahon wanted to do. But he just wasn't a great wrestler in the ring. Ric Flair was much better, and there were probably 5 or 6 guys in the National Wrestling Alliance that were much better. And that is not an insult to Hogan necessarily, because who would say that when John Cena was the biggest superstar in professional wrestling in the 2010s, that he was the greatest wrestler? He was far from it. He was a great superstar. He did the things that John Cena should be doing to get over, but he was not the greatest wrestler in the ring by a long stretch. Being the biggest superstar does not equate to being the greatest wrestler. So that was the only thing I took exception to. So I'm kind of skipping around a little bit today. I have some recommendations and updates, and then I'm going to give an update about the podcast that a little bit later when we do the reviews. And I had one thing down here to review, but then I had forgotten about a match that came out that I definitely want to talk about that came out on WWE Vault and that's available on YouTube. But my recommendations this week are a little bit different. I have a book recommendation, The Pulpit War, The Secret History of Pius XII, Mussolini, and Hitler by David I. Kurtzer. And I thought this was a very balanced and fair look at the war years in Italy, the Pope and Mussolini and Hitler. And when you read it, there are lots of lessons in there for things that we see today. I'm going to recommend a show that I watched for the first time probably 4 years ago. I don't think I was back at the university yet when I saw the show, and it may be my favorite Mexican television show on Netflix. It's between that and El Dragon, The Return of a Warrior. I love that show. But Who Killed Sarah is much more digestible. It's 3 seasons, and there's less episodes over there's 3 seasons than there is in the first episode of El Dragon. So it's Who Killed Sarah on Netflix. And then I wanted to recommend something that we're going to actually review in a week or two. And that is a movie that I saw in the mid 1980s, but it was made in 1977. And it's called Mad Bull, starring Alex Karras. And it's a made for TV movie about professional wrestling. So it's on YouTube, and we'll be reviewing that in the upcoming weeks. My website, kenzermanjr.com, where you can find the show notes for all the episodes, is back to normal after a couple of months. I've got newsletter sign up back up as well. You can check that website out. It's got the things I'm working on, plenty of past articles about professional wrestling, and St. Louis history if you're interested in that. Divided Championship, I released last month, and it's available on ebook, audiobook, paperback, and hardcover on Amazon. And this week I started on the second edition of the St. Louis Civil War, the streetcar strike of 1900. That's one of my very first books that I wrote on St. Louis. Not the first, but it's close to it. It's a little short, and it really didn't do justice to how serious of a thing this was at the time that it occurred. So I wanted to, I mean, basically it crippled and shut down the city for about 4 months. And it was so violent that Chicago settled their streetcar strike the following year because they were afraid of the kind of violence that they saw in St. Louis, and they didn't want to see that in Chicago. So the second edition, I plan that to be a better capture of really the significance of the event for St. Louis and the long lasting effects it had, making St. Louis a union town, some of the distrust people had for the power structure in St. Louis after that strike. So I'll be working on that project, I'm assuming, for about the next 3 to 4 months. The history topic for this week's show, I didn't even really know one of the particulars until a month or two ago when I found the first articles from the 1860s. And this wrestler was very active in the 1860s and also wrestled in the 1870s. And his name was Homer Lane. And Homer Lane, Lane, was a specialist in collar and elbow wrestling. Well, I knew several of the collar and elbow wrestlers from the 1870s and 1880s because I had written articles before about J.H. McLaughlin wrestling Henry Moses Duffer, and I had written about John McMahon and William Muldoon refusing to wrestle a mixed wrestling bout with McMahon in a collar and elbow fall. So William Muldoon would occasionally, if he didn't feel too threatened, wrestle someone in their specialty that was outside of Greco-Roman wrestling. Muldoon would wrestle anybody Greco-Roman because he was a Greco-Roman wrestling specialist. However, he absolutely refused to even wrestle, even if the match was not for the title. So the title was always contested under Greco-Roman wrestling rules when William Muldoon was the world champion from 1880 to 1889. The first person I learned of that was a collar and elbow wrestling specialist was John McMahon. Because in the 1880s, John McMahon tried to get William Muldoon to wrestle him in a mixed styles match. It wouldn't have been for the title, but he was hoping to use it to set up a title match. And he wanted one of the falls to be in collar and elbow wrestling, which Muldoon refused. And Muldoon did the same thing with the catch wrestlers, but the reason he did it with the catch wrestlers was he was concerned that one of them would put him in a submission hold and hurt him on purpose, making it harder for him to defend his world title when they would wrestle under Greco-Roman wrestling rules. So while he wrestled Edwin Bibby and he wrestled Evan Strangler Lewis, he would only wrestle them in Greco-Roman wrestling matches. He would not wrestle them even one fall in catch-as-catch-can wrestling. He refused to wrestle Joe Acton, period. So Joe Acton, the little demon, who was one of the more skilled catch-as-catch-can wrestlers of the 1880s, and the second American heavyweight wrestling champion. Muldoon flat out refused to wrestle Acton, period. Getting back to the collar and elbow wrestling. So we know that Muldoon didn't want to wrestle John McMahon in collar and elbow wrestling. And I knew that John McMahon had taken the title, the collar and elbow championship, from J.H. McLaughlin. But there was really a big four of collar and elbow wrestling in the 1870s, early 1880s. And that big four was Henry Moses Duffer, J.H. McLaughlin, John McMahon, and now I come to find out Homer Lane. And Homer Lane was associated with a gentleman named Henry Hill. Henry Hill may have been a wrestler at one time. When Homer Lane is associated with him, he owns a bar, tavern in New York that is a hangout for the sporting men. And when you hear that term used around this time, when you hear it's a bar for sporting men, it's for fans, managers, promoters, and the actual contestants in either professional wrestling matches or bare knuckle prize fighting matches. Glove boxing starts to become a thing in the U.S. in the early 1890s. In the time that we're talking about, 1860s, 1870s, the prize fighting bouts are bare knuckle, and they're illegal almost everywhere. So when they hold these bouts, they look for places where there's a small police force. It's out rural and, a very isolated area, because they're trying to keep away from the authorities to actually stage these bouts, which are illegal. Professional wrestling would become legal much sooner. Bare knuckle prize fighting never did. It was not until they had glove boxing contests that becomes a legal sport. So Henry Hill organizes this circuit of collar and elbow wrestlers to wrestle Homer Lane. And the big three that I know now, having read, that participated in matches that Henry Hill either promoted or was the referee for, a lot of them were around the New York area, were Homer Lane, J.H. McLaughlin, and John McMahon. John McMahon was part of that group too. I can't find where Henry Moses Duffer was ever associated with them. This is early days. I'm just barely getting into this research. And I read some of the stuff other people wrote about them first to see if I even wanted to look into this. But it does look like it may be one of the earliest group of wrestlers who were working or prearranging the exhibitions for the fans. And a lot of times that was done to make it a little bit more exciting, came later. Most of the time, at this time, it's to bilk people in gambling. So you're trying to, you go out in a crowd, you send, let me go back to the beginning. If you are the manager, you go first. If I want to put on a professional wrestling match in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, up into the 90s and the early 1900s, usually the manager kind of serves as the quasi promoter, because he will go out and he will find backers. And backers are almost always wealthy fans of professional wrestling that want to see the match and are okay if they lose money on this promotion. Just like in modern time, the people that are controlling the sport don't tend to lose the money. So at this time, the managers and wrestlers were in the driver's seat, because there is no promotional system like we would think of in when I started becoming a fan in 79, 80. But when people started watching wrestlers in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, you had these promoters all throughout the United States who promoted their towns. That becomes a thing in the United States in the 19 teens. Prior to that, you have the system I'm talking about now. So you go out as the manager and promoter, or the manager slash quasi promoter. You go out and you find backers that will pay the money to either rent the venue. And so once you've got the venue, then you sell tickets. And if you make a lot of money, some of that money might find its way back to the backers. but the manager and wrestlers are going to take the biggest cut first. So how you enhance your revenue from these matches, besides just the gate, which will become the most important thing in the 1930s and 40s, when the authorities try to stamp out the gambling because they know it's a work sport and people are being bilked, then the ticket sales are everything. But during this time, and all the way up until the authorities started stomping out the gambling, gambling could make you as much or more money than the gate receipts. And how they would manipulate the gambling is they would send out people that would go through the crowd and take bets. And so I know that if I've got Henry Moses Doofer, don't use Doofer because I don't know that he was part of it. And I have not heard of him taking part in gambling schemes. Early days, he may very well have, but I don't want to cast any aspersions on him, seeing that I don't know that he ever took part in this. But two people who I knew were involved with this potential ring and who may have worked matches based on a couple of the accounts that I've read are J.H. McLaughlin and Homer Lane. So say I am the Henry Hill, and I've sent these people out, and we know that if Homer Lane gets the first fall because the crowd's all bet on J.H. McLaughlin, we're going to make a killing. So funny enough, Homer Lane is going to get the quickest fall. If we sent people out in the crowd and all the money came in on Homer Lane to win the actual match, we know we'll make the most money if it's J.H. McLaughlin beats Homer Lane, which would be what happens. So you're seeing where all the money is coming in, and then you're doing the opposite result so that you make the money. The fans that bet on Homer Lane to win will lose that money to the promotion and manager's gambling operation if McLaughlin is the winner. So that is how they manipulated the results of the matches to increase their gambling revenue. Hopefully the way I explained that made sense, but that's basically they had their workers out in the crowd. To show you how long this went on, in 1911, George Hackenschmidt, before the second match, wanted to cancel that match because he had gotten injured in training. He was not really much of a match for Gotch 3 years earlier in 1908. By 1911, he had been more or less semi-retired. He had been wrestling exhibitions. He had been training wrestlers, but he had not really been wrestling competitively until a few months before that match. But he started feeling like the knee would hold up, so he decided to take the match after refusing it for 2 or 3 years because he did have knee problems going into the 1908 match with Gotch. He lost that match because he couldn't handle Gotch's fouling, and he would not return the favor and foul Gotch back, which is what caused him to lose that match, not his knee. The 1911 match, he lost that because of his knee being even more debilitated than it had been in 1908. He wants to call off the match. Jack Curley, who would become the New York City promoter in the mid-teens, and one of the most unscrupulous individuals who ever graced the dirty profession. So professional wrestling has always been a little on the shady side from its earliest beginnings. You know, it began in the carnivals, and if you took on a local wrestler who was doing really good, they would get him near the side of the tent, and somebody hit him in the back of the head with a 2x4. They did that the same thing in the boxing exhibitions in the carnival days as well, because the carnivals were not in the business to lose money. Same thing with their professional wrestling at the carnival shows. You know, they'd kind of get you to the one side of the ring where there was a curtain or anything. And once your head got pushed up against that thing, somebody would hit it with a board from the other side. Curly, being a disreputable guy that he talks Hackenschmidt into going along with the match, but says, we'll cancel the betting. When Curly tells him that, Hackenschmidt agrees, okay, I'll go on. And Curly does announce in all of the newspapers a day or two before the match, all bets are off. But then Curly also, on the day of the actual wrestling match, sends his workers out into the crowd to start generating bets on the match. So he knows, what the outcome is going to be, but he can't manipulate this outcome because they're wrestling in a contest. So all he's interested in is trying to get people to bet on Hackenschmidt. If people want to bet on Gotch, the workers won't take the money. But if they want to bet on Hackenschmidt, they'll take the money because they know that Hackenschmidt is not going to win this match. He's too injured, despite the fact that they had announced it in the newspaper. According to Jack Curley, talking to Marcus Griffin 20 years later for The Fall Guys, which is a book full of inaccuracies, this is one thing, knowing the people involved. I could believe that this happened. It's just, were people that foolish? So, in a crowd of 30,000 fans, if the figure that Jack Curley threw out there is correct, he supposedly made $60,000 off of fans who bet on Hackenschmidt during that second match. Now, realize they would have been betting on him to win. They would have been betting on him for quickest fall, blah, blah, blah. But according to Curley, what he told Griffin, he won $60,000 in gambling revenue from a match that he had told the fans that there are no bets. We've called off the bets. It's early days. I need to do a lot more research about this group. I've heard and read what other people say, but after doing the Divided Championship and a couple of other things where I've had to go back and backtrack later on because I didn't research it myself, I took the word of others. From now on, unless I've done the research and I believe it in my heart that this is what happened, I am not making any pronouncements anymore. I had said on this podcast early on that Joe Stecker, afraid of double crosses, virtually retired the title for the almost 3 years that he held his version of the world title. And Lewis kept defending the title like he was the world champion. That could not have been further from the truth. Lewis did defend his title like he was still the world champion. But Joe Stecker was more active and had the stronger claim to being the world champion. But I had repeated that false information because so many people that I respect and believed had said it because they got it from the Fall Guys. And the Fall Guys is a great source to start your research. It is a terrible source to just take at face value and say, this is the way it happened, because so much of it didn't happen. Some of it is because Marcus Griffin had been in the Buffalo office, had heard these stories, but wrote that book with the purpose of making professional wrestling look bad because he was pissed off that he had been fired by the Buffalo office. He's also taking stories that the wrestlers told him over the years, and wrestlers and promoters love to embellish the stories. There are so many apocryphal tales around professional wrestling because the facts and the truth are very interesting, but you're dealing with people who work all the time, and that includes in their promos. So they'll start to tell the truth and then they start to twist it. And they do the same thing with these stories. They're kind of telling you the truth, but they leave stuff out or they put a little twist on it. It's not exactly the way it's. So until you do the research, you really don't know that that's the way things happen. Now, I have been finding as I've been reading about this group that there was professional wrestling in the United States before the Civil War, which I always suspected. But I do want to say I don't have any intention of going back unless I get super bored one day. I have no intention of going back and looking at that because I study history, whether it's combat sports or St. Louis history. I have always had my focus between 1866, 1868, and 1928. And the reason for that is if you go to any library, you might find a couple books about the Roaring Twenties now, particularly because so many people have written about Prohibition. But if you go into any library in the United States and you go into the American history section, you will see shelves of books on the Civil War. And then you will see probably half a shelf of books between the Civil War and the Great Depression. And then the Great Depression and World War II, you'll see shelves and shelves of books. This period of time, which encompassed the Gilded Age and World War One, the turn of the century, is one of the, if not the most neglected time periods in American history. The only other time that probably can claim to be about as neglected is the time between the end of the War of 1812 and the beginning of the Civil War. Those two time periods are the two most neglected in American history. And I've always been more interested in the time period between the Civil War and the Great Depression. So I don't really think I'll be going back further than that. And the other reason that for professional wrestling research, I'm not that interested in the Greco-Roman circuits and the collar and elbow and all that. My interest has always been catch can wrestling. I love submissions. I've done judo and jujitsu. I've done judo now for 20 plus years. For me, my interest in professional wrestling was always the catch can wrestling, which became the dominant style in the 1890s after Evan Strangler Lewis defeated Ernst Rober to unify the American Heavyweight Wrestling Championship in catch wrestling and the American Heavyweight Wrestling Championship in Greco-Roman wrestling. They never had a unification match over the Greco-Roman, not Greco-Roman, over the collar and elbow championship because John McMahon was pretty much retired by that time, and I don't think McMahon had any interest in wrestling with Evan Strangler Lewis at that point in time. Lewis was just a mean, nasty wrestler, and if you caught him wrong or irritated him, even in matches where he originally started out working, he'd hurt you. So I think McMahon figured, I made enough money, I've got a big enough reputation. I don't need to be messing around with that guy. I think I'm going to end the history topic this week right there. The next week, I think that I'm going to talk about Joe Stecker versus John Olin in an odd match from 1916. I think this might be one of the early double crosses, but it was not the wrestler as much as it was the promoter, and it didn't go anywhere. It was always an odd match. I found it years ago, and I thought it was bizarre, and I just kind of filed it away for later. Well, I've had a chance to go back and read some more about it. I'm thinking now it might have been a contest, but the double cross part came on the referee's part, who was also the promoter. So this might have been an early promoter trying for a double cross. And before I get into the reviews, I just wanted to make an announcement about the podcast. So for the remainder of 2025, I will release an episode every week with the exception of the second Monday of each month. Because I've got a few posts that I've already written that I'm going to release. And then in 2026, and I feel horrible that I'm doing this now because this was always something Dan talked about and really wanted. And, I'll dedicate it 2026 to Dan because it was definitely his idea. I am going to take the podcast weekly, Weekly, not Weakly, in 2026. So in 2026, I will release an episode every Monday for that year. And right now, I plan on having a history topic every week. We'll see if I'm able to pull that off, particularly in the summer months where I'm super busy at work. But that is going to be my goal. The review this week, I was actually going to talk about SummerSlam, and I think I'm going to start with that because I want to end with a match that was just released in the WWE Vault, and I'm going to kind of take my memory back to 1981, 1980 and 1981 to talk about ICW wrestling in Cape Girardeau. So first, let's start with SummerSlam. So WWE had SummerSlam this past weekend. To be honest, I only watched two matches because I had saw the coverage that Seth Rollins had worked the knee injury and he came out and took the title from CM Punk. And I'm really not all that interested in any of that. I think it's a discount bloodline, although the second match I watched really disgusted me, and I didn't even watch Raw on Monday night. The first match I watched was Roman Reigns and Jey Uso versus Braun Breaker and Bronson Reed. And I did enjoy the match. I thought it maybe went just a little, just a hair too long, but other than that, I really thought it was a great match. I like this dynamic that's developing between Roman and Jey, who always had great chemistry together. And I'm interested in that storyline still. Not enough to watch Raw on Monday night, but I'll probably go back and check out those segments after I get the taste out of my mouth for this past event. The second match I watched was from Sunday night, and that was Solo Sikoa versus Jacob Fatu. And the reason I watched that match is because I figured Jacob Fatu was going to get the U.S. title back, and this discount bloodline feud with Jacob Fatu would be over, and they would be moving Jacob Fatu on to bigger and better things. So you can imagine my shock when Solo Sikoa retains the U.S. title because Talatonga, the 7-foot tall Tongan, kicked the cage door into Jacob Fatu's face, which makes me think that they think their next big feud for Jacob Fatu is with this Talatonga. And he needs to be done with this discount bloodline and moving on. They're treating Solo Sikoa like he's Jacob Fatu, and they're treating Jacob Fatu like he's Jimmy Uso. This is ridiculous. I thought the WWE lost their way when Rock horned his way in WrestleMania again this year and pushed the whole John Cena heel turn, which was a disaster. And I think they're still searching their to get back to where they were before. Now, drew huge crowds. You cannot take away what they're doing as a company. They're still drawing huge crowds, but I wonder how long that's going to keep up if they keep doing things that aren't popular with the fans, like the John Cena heel turn. That was easy for me to say. Think I'm going to tap out on WWE for a while until they can get their act back together. I've not changed my mind. Triple H, Paul Levesque is still the best person to do their creative. He's much better than Vince over the last 20 years, probably. Vince had lost it a long time ago. But it's not what it was a year or two ago. But, all people get a little stale from time to time. And hopefully they can right the ship and get it back on track. But what I did want to talk about was a wrestling match that they just put up on WWE Vault, and I will put a link to it in the show notes at kenzermanjr.com, episode 97. And it's a match from Cape Girardeau in 1985 between Randy Macho Man Savage and Jerry Lawler. Basically, it's functioning that day as a spot show for the Memphis territory, but Cape Girardeau had been a regular ICW town, which was the company that Randy Poffo and Lanny Poffo wrestled for. I think they were part owners, but the main owner for that company was their father, Angelo Poffo. It was an outlaw organization, and it ran primarily in Kentucky. My family is from a small town called Scott City on the Zimmerman side, my natural father's side. They are from a small town in southeast Missouri called Scott City, which is a few miles south of Cape Girardeau. Cape Girardeau butts into Scott City on the north side of Scott City. I spent a lot of time in Cape Girardeau not from the Cape Girardeau, in Scott City in 1979, 1980, 1981. Then I didn't see my natural father for like 2.5 years. So by the time I went back down there in 84, the ICW was defunct at that time. They were no longer in operation. But from 1980 to 1983, they regularly ran Cape Girardeau at the Cape Arena, which I believe is the AC Braze Arena today. The Osage Center was not built until either late 80s, early 90s. And the Show Me Center wasn't built to the late 80s, and there was no way they were running the Show Me Center for ICW. WWE, I did attend a show there in 1988 with my stepsister and her husband. And then Danny, when he moved down to Scott City in 1989, he and I went to several WWE shows down there in the early 90s. I did not go to any wrestling shows in Cape Girardeau in the 80s, so I did not see ICW live, but I did see it on television. And Jim Cornette was talking about that ICW ran Harrisburg, and the ABC affiliate was from Harrisburg down in Cape Girardeau. But for some reason, I thought that I saw the ICW television show on the Channel 6 from Paducah, Kentucky, the NBC affiliate. They had the show, and I think it was on either real late at night or real early in the morning on Saturday night or Sunday morning. But that show ran either from the Harrisburg TV station or the Paducah TV station in the 1980s because when I would go down to Scott City, they had cable. We didn't get cable in St. Louis till 1986. They had cable in 1979. So I'd watch the Georgia wrestling on Saturday. Well, I stumbled across this ICW show at some point, and that's where I saw Randy Macho Man Savage. And ICW was a really cut rate, definitely outlawish promotion, but they had this guy named Randy Macho Man Savage who was amazing, and he was the ICW World Champion. So every time I would go down there to see my dad, or he would take us down there to see my grandma, and then his girlfriend at the time, who became my stepmother later that year in December of 1980, I would watch that show. It was very forgettable. Ronnie Garvin wasn't on it when I was watching it, I don't believe. But I do remember Randy Savage. He really stood out. Flash forward 1983, Larry Matisick is running an outlaw promotion against the St. Louis Wrestling Club in St. Louis. And I went to a couple of those shows at the Checker Dome, and he brought Randy Savage from ICW for those shows. So I saw Randy Savage in person in 83 in St. Louis when Larry Matisick was running his promotion. It only lasted for about 6 or 7 months, but we saw some of the Southwest Championship Wrestling guys like Adrian Adonis when he was claiming to be the undisputed world champion. And we saw Randy Savage. And Randy Savage had a couple memorable matches. Funny enough, Danny never saw Randy Savage was his favorite wrestler when we were kids. He never saw Savage until Savage was in the WWF in I think 85, 86. So I was familiar with ICW. Well, the WWE Vault purchased the ICW tapes, and this show, even though it was a Memphis spot show, they called it an ICW show because Jerry Jarrett and Jerry Lawler, I believe, bought the rights to the ICW name from Angelo Poffo when they started using Randy and Lanny and had this tailor-made feud because people knew that the Poffos were outlaws in the area running against Jarrett, so they had this built-in feud between him and Lawler. WWE Vault released this match, and I do recommend it. The thing that it goes about 35 minutes, but I say they spent the first 15 or 20 minutes jumping out of the ring and talking on the house mic at each other. And it's an interesting match because I don't think anywhere else in the Memphis territory people would have been or people would have been cheering for Randy Savage, but because ICW ran in Cape regularly for those 3 years, and people had seen Macho Man Randy Savage, even though he was a heel on the television show down there, that was about a 50-50 reaction. Lawler got cheers about from half of the fans and boos from about half the fans, and the same thing for Savage. And there were several chants of, come on, Randy, get him, Randy. So that's something you're never going to see on a Memphis card back when Jerry was the king, but it's the unique circumstances of the geography of them wrestling there in Cape Girardeau. Spent a lot of time on the mic. There was this guy sitting ringside that I didn't remember, but I knew it wasn't Angelo Poffolo. Angelo Poffo. He's way too young. So I went and I looked up, and his manager name was Tex Newman, and he was a heel manager in Memphis for 6 months to a year after Jimmy Hart had left and gone to the WWF at the time. Tex Newman is actually Jeff Walton, who I believe has a podcast. That was his managerial persona for those 6 months in Memphis. But he's at ringside, and Lawler makes several comments about him. But they keep jumping out of the ring and getting on this house mic. And then they get in the ring eventually after about 15, 20 minutes of this, and they have a hell of a match for about the next 15 minutes. These guys really went at it for the next 15 minutes. If you went through all the buildup of them jumping out and jawing at each other and everything, and it's not great video. It's definitely not great audio. You can't hear exactly what they're saying to each other very often, but you can hear the reactions of the crowd, which are pretty interesting. Watch this match. You'll see a rare Memphis wrestling match where Jerry Lawler gets a mixed reaction, and it's only because they ran a spot show in Cape Girardeau where Randy Savage had been probably the biggest name on that card for 3 years. And Cape was not a place that got regular wrestling. St. Louis didn't run shows down there. I don't think that probably was technically in the McGirt territory, but it could have been in Goulas Welsh because they also are in Memphis, which isn't too far from Cape. But nobody ran that town regularly that I can find other than the ICW. Today, they've got actually an independent group that wrestles down there, a small independent, but this was not an area that was ran regularly. WWF came there several times because the Show Me Center is a college arena for the SEMO basketball team. And I don't know what the capacity is, but it's 8,000 maybe. It's about comparable to a Kiel Auditorium or something like that. They filled that place up the few times they came down. I don't know how long it's been since they've been down there. Maybe they still regularly run it when they come through Kansas City and St. Louis, but the crowd was pretty hot for the WWF back in the late 80s, early 90s. Well, that's it for this episode of It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. KenZimmermanJr.com is the place to check out the show notes for today's episode. You can view the show notes for this episode at KenZimmermanJr.com/episode 97. You can also see what I'm working on currently in a list of books I've written if you're interested in digging deeper into this era of professional wrestling. Thank you for listening today. There's also now a way to sign up for the newsletter, the monthly newsletter. And when you sign up for the monthly newsletter, you get a free ebook on the top 10 legitimate professional wrestlers from 1870 to 1915. I would also be grateful if you would rate this podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to the show. That helps tremendously with keeping the podcast visible so people who have never heard of it can discover it. If you have already done this, thank you so much. And then if you would like to comment on any episode or just drop me a line, you can send me an email at ken@kenzimmermanjr.com. I'd love to hear from you. Until next week, everybody, take care. Bye-bye.